Racist woman pounded Big Shaq's mother's door like it was her right, but every slam wasn't just noise. It was a trigger. Moments later, Big Shaq returned, not to visit but to confront a storm that had pushed too far, and when Big Shaq stepped in, regret wasn't just felt. It echoed across the whole block. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. In the hush of early morning, light spilled softly through towering windows, painting the polished hardwood floors of Shaquille O'Neal's Florida estate with golden streaks. The sun's warmth greeted him like an old friend, as he completed the last set of push-ups in his sprawling home gym. His breaths came deep and steady, and his mind, though vast like his stature, was grounded in simple gratitude. He was Big Shaq, but to those who mattered most he was just Shaq, a man of gravity, humor and heart. Shaq grabbed a towel, draping it over his neck, and glanced at his reflection in the wall mirror. Sweat beaded on his forehead, the evidence of his early discipline. The mirror offered a glimpse of his own legacy, a man not just known for basketball records or celebrity status, but for his unwavering dedication to family, humility and quiet strength. He checked his phone briefly, no urgent messages, and smiled. Today was Saturday, the day reserved for visiting his mother, Lucille O'Neal. As he drove the familiar route to Lucille's house, the world seemed untouched by conflict. The sky was clear, the birds in their morning chorus. The scent of fresh grass mingled with the faint aroma of spring flowers. Traffic was light, and neighbors waved as his vehicle passed, an acknowledgement not of his fame, but of his genuine presence in their community. This was home, where titles meant little, and the measure of a man was in how he treated others. Lucille's modest home, just a few blocks away from Shaq's estate, stood as a testament to resilience. It was a brick house with white trim, a garden that Lucille tended herself, and a front porch that welcomed anyone who sought comfort. Shaq parked in the driveway, pausing for a moment, as he took in the familiar sight. The house wasn't large or ostentatious, but it was filled with memories, of shared meals, laughter and long conversations on lazy afternoons. Pushing the front door open, he was greeted by the comforting scent of Lucille's homemade cinnamon rolls mingling with freshly brewed coffee. The kitchen, a warm and welcoming space, was bathed in sunlight, the curtains fluttering gently in the breeze. Lucille stood at the stove, her back straight, her hair pulled neatly into a bun. She turned as Shaq entered, her face lighting up with the same maternal pride that had carried him through decades of challenges. "Morning, son," she said, her voice steady and strong. "Morning, Mama," Shaq replied, leaning down to kiss her cheek. They moved easily around each other in the kitchen, a dance familiar through years of shared routines. Lucille handed him a plate, and he helped set the table. Over steaming cups of coffee and warm rolls, they talked about simple things: the weather, her garden, a new neighbor who had moved in down the street. Lucille's voice was smooth, her laughter easy, but Shaq noticed a fleeting weariness in her eyes. He knew she'd been handling more than she let on, managing the property, fielding the occasional disgruntled neighbor, and carrying the weight of a community that looked up to her. Lucille had always been strong, born into a time where opportunities were scarce and prejudice was rampant. She had carved out a space for herself with grace and grit. She raised Shaq to be proud, yet humble, confident, yet kind. She taught him that true power wasn't in muscle or fame, but in compassion and resilience. The stories of her youth, the battles fought quietly in boardrooms and church halls, the sacrifices made for her family were woven into the fabric of their lives. "Your foundation event went well, didn't it?" Lucille asked, sipping her coffee. Shaq nodded, a hint of pride in his voice. "It did. We raised enough for the kids' program. They'll get their new center this year." Lucille's eyes shone. "That's good work, son. They need hope. You're giving them that." Shaq felt a swell of gratitude. Despite his wealth and success, it was these moments, shared with his mother over coffee and stories, that grounded him. He knew the world outside this kitchen wasn't always kind. He'd faced his share of public scrutiny, unfair judgments, and subtle racism that lurked beneath polite smiles. But here with Lucille, there was only truth, strength, and love. As the morning stretched on, they moved to the porch. Shaq sipped his second cup of coffee, while Lucille tended to her roses. The sun climbed higher, dappling the yard with light. Birds fluttered in the trees, and the hum of a distant lawnmower added a soft backdrop to their conversation. It was peaceful, almost deceptively so. Lucille paused by a rosebush, her hands lightly brushing the petals. "I've been getting a lot of knocks on the door lately," she said, her tone casual, but her eyes clouded. Shaq's brow furrowed. "From who?" "New neighbor, I think. A woman. Says she's just checking in. But it's been a bit much. Always asking questions about the property lines. Doesn't feel right." Shaq's jaw tightened slightly, though he kept his tone gentle. "I'll look into it. Mama. Don't worry." Lucille nodded, her smile brave but thin. She straightened, brushing soil from her hands. "I'm sure it's nothing. Just a nosy neighbor. Still, it rattles me a bit." Shaq stood, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I'll make sure she stops bothering you. You shouldn't have to deal with that." Lucille's gratitude was unspoken but clear. They stood together in the bright morning sun, the air filled with the scent of roses, and the quiet promise of a day that at that moment still held peace. Neither of them could know that this tranquility was about to shatter, that the quiet day would soon give way to echoes of fear, desperation, and a confrontation that would test their strength in ways neither had imagined. But for now, as Shaq helped Lucille carry her gardening tools back inside, the warmth of family and the comfort of routine masked the storm that loomed just beyond the horizon. The morning had settled into an easy rhythm, the kind where the world hums in harmony and the hours stretch out like a comforting embrace. Shaq, after spending the early hours with his mother, decided to step out for a brief errand, just a run to pick up some fresh bread and a few things Lucille had mentioned earlier. He promised to be back soon, leaving his mother seated comfortably on the porch, her hands busy with pruning a stubborn rosebush that refused to bloom. As Shaq's car rolled down the driveway, the faint sound of birdsong lingered in the air, and Lucille, feeling a rare moment of peace, returned her attention to her garden. It wasn't long after Shaq's departure that the mood shifted. Lucille was inside the house, humming a quiet tune as she arranged the morning dishes, when the first knock echoed through the front door. It wasn't a polite tap, nor the firm knock of a delivery driver. It was sharp, insistent, like a demand. Lucille hesitated, her heart skipping just slightly, and approached the door with cautious curiosity. Through the frosted glass pane, she glimpsed the silhouette of a woman, tall, angular, with a stance that exuded both impatience and arrogance. Lucille opened the door a crack, the chain still latched, and found herself face to face with a woman she recognized from passing, but had never formally met. Her name was Beverly Calloway, a new resident in the neighborhood, one who had already garnered whispers of being difficult and confrontational. Beverly's expression was tight, her mouth a thin line, her eyes flashing with something far beyond irritation. "Yes? Can I help you?" Lucille asked, her voice calm but wary. "I need to speak with the owner of this property." Beverly snapped, her tone clipped. "There are concerns about the property lines and the disturbances coming from this house. You need to come out here and answer a few questions." Lucille's breath caught, her fingers tightening slightly on the doorframe. "I'm not aware of any disturbances. Perhaps we can discuss this another time." But Beverly wasn't listening. Her hand shot out, striking the door with a heavy, deliberate knock. Then another, and another, the sound reverberating through the wood, like gunshots. Each pounding strike was louder, more aggressive, more insistent. Lucille's heart jumped in her chest, her pulse accelerating in a sudden rush of anxiety. "I'm not leaving until I get some answers." Beverly's voice rose, sharp and unrelenting. Lucille tried to reason with her, her voice steady but now tinged with alarm. "Please, I'm an elderly woman. There's no reason for this kind of behavior. If there's a problem, we can resolve it calmly." But Beverly's response was more pounding, louder and more frantic, echoing through the quiet street. The knocks weren't just loud, they were deliberate, almost rhythmic, as though she was trying to intimidate not just Lucille, but the very walls of the house itself. The sound rattled the pictures on the walls inside, sent a small vase quivering on the hallway table. Lucille's breathing quickened, her chest tightening with a growing sense of dread. She tried to step back from the door, but her legs felt heavy, her pulse erratic. The sound wasn't just at the door, it seemed to echo in her mind, amplifying her fear with each knock. She thought of Shaq, of his easy smile that morning, of the way he had promised to return soon. If only he were here now, to intervene, to shield her from this escalating intrusion. "Go away, please," she called out, her voice now carrying a tremor. But Beverly's fists continued their relentless assault on the door, each blow heavier, sharper, more insistent. There was no rational conversation here, only an onslaught of noise and pressure, a barrage of sound that pushed against Lucille's composure and seeped into her bones. Outside, neighbors began to take notice, glancing from windows, their faces registering confusion and concern. Some recognized Beverly, others only knew Lucille as the kind woman who tended her roses and always greeted them with a smile. But no one stepped in. The knocks continued, echoing down the street like a drumbeat of impending crisis. Lucille's hand clutched her chest, her breathing shallow. Her heartbeat was erratic now, a stuttering pulse of panic that no amount of deep breaths could slow. The air felt thick, her vision blurred around the edges. Still, Beverly's voice cut through the haze. "I won't stop until you come out and talk to me." The pounding was a physical force, pressing against the walls, against Lucille's resolve. Her mind raced. She had to stay calm, to keep her composure, but the fear was relentless. The echoes on the door relentless, each knock a hammer driving deeper into her chest. Lucille stumbled back, her hand gripping the edge of a table for support. The room tilted slightly, the sounds outside morphing into a distorted symphony of pounding and distant voices. She thought of her son, of the way he had always been her protector, her steady anchor in a world that sometimes felt too heavy. But today she was alone, and Beverly's assault on the door showed no sign of stopping. A sharp pain shot through Lucille's chest, radiating down her arm. Her breath came in shallow gasps now, her mind struggling to stay present. She fought against the tide of panic, her fingers scrabbling for the phone. But the world seemed to narrow around her, the pounding outside synchronizing with the racing beat of her heart. "Someone help," she whispered, though her voice was lost amidst the relentless knocking. The scene held a dreadful clarity, a woman of grace and strength, brought to the edge not by physical violence, but by a relentless storm of noise and aggression. Beverly's face outside the window was flushed with determination, her eyes blind to the damage she was causing. And still, the knocking continued. Each echo on the door a countdown, each beat a relentless push against Lucille's failing strength. She sank to her knees, the room spinning, the sounds merging into a single overwhelming crescendo. The last thing she saw before the world tilted into darkness was a beam of sunlight casting long shadows across the floor, a stark contrast to the chaos that had engulfed her peaceful morning. The moment Lucille's knees met the cold hardwood floor, a sharp jolt of awareness flashed through her, a realization that something was wrong, something deep inside her chest that wasn't easing up with a steady breath. Her fingers, trembling now, sought out the edge of the console table nearby, her mind willing her body to rise, to hold on just long enough to catch a breath, to quiet the storm hammering inside her. But the pounding on the door only grew louder, more frantic, each heavy thump a merciless echo that sent vibrations shuddering through the floorboards and up her spine. It was as though the world outside had conspired to shake her apart from the inside. Lucille tried to focus, to center herself amidst the gathering fog behind her eyes, but the physical distress was rising like a tide she couldn't hold back. Her heartbeat was no longer steady. It raced in erratic bursts, hammering against her ribs like fists, each beat sharper and more urgent than the last. Her breaths came shallow, quick gasps that failed to fill her lungs, as though the air itself was thinning, denying her the lifeline she so desperately needed. She could feel the cold sweat on her forehead, the trembling in her hands, and the way her vision narrowed, the edges blurring like she was peering down a long tunnel. Outside, Beverly's voice cut through the air, her words sharp and insistent, though Lucille could no longer make out the specifics. They were just sounds now, rising and falling, a relentless pressure that layered over the knocking, a brutal symphony of insistence and demand. Lucille's mind clung to fragments of memory, the morning's conversation with Shaq, his laughter, the gentle clink of coffee cups, his promise to return soon. She tried to latch onto the memory, to draw strength from the image of her son's steady presence, but even that was slipping away beneath the weight of her physical distress. Her chest tightened further, a sharp squeezing pain radiating down her left arm, leaving her fingers numb. Panic clawed at her throat, a silent scream that never found its voice. She willed herself to move, to crawl towards the phone that sat just a few feet away on the console table, its screen dark and unresponsive, a lifeline so close yet utterly unreachable. Her arms shook beneath her, her muscles weak, her breath coming in ragged gasps, as though her body was rebelling against the very act of survival. A wave of dizziness overtook her, and she slumped forward, her forehead resting briefly against the cool wood floor. The pounding outside seemed to intensify, the sound merging with the hammering of her own heart, each knock a cruel reminder that she was trapped within her own failing body, her mind still sharp enough to recognize the danger, but her limbs too uncooperative to act. Through the haze, Lucille's mind flickered to a memory. Years ago, Shaq as a child, scared during a thunderstorm, his small hand clutching hers as lightning split the sky and thunder roared around them. "It's just noise, baby," she had said then, her voice steady, her heart strong. "It's just noise. We're safe inside." Now the memory twisted cruelly, the roles reversed, and it was Lucille trapped by the storm outside her door, with no comforting hand to hold, no voice to reassure her. Her lips parted, a whisper of Shaq's name slipping through, though her voice was too faint to carry beyond the walls. The pain in her chest flared, sharp and searing, and her thoughts fragmented further, slipping away like grains of sand through trembling fingers. The room seemed to tilt around her, the colors fading into a muted wash of gray and white. Somewhere distant, a neighbor's voice called out, but it was faint, distorted, as though underwater. Lucille's mind fought to hold on, to focus on the rhythm of her breathing, to summon the strength to survive. But her body was no longer obeying her commands. Her arms, once strong from years of tending gardens and lifting groceries, now felt leaden and useless. Her legs refused to move. Her chest ached with each shallow breath. The pounding on the door continued, relentless, each echo a cruel counterpoint to her failing heartbeat. For a fleeting moment, she imagined Shaq bursting through the door, his strong arms lifting her, his voice steady and commanding as he called for help. She could almost feel his presence beside her, a phantom of reassurance and love. But the image faded as quickly as it came, replaced by the stark reality of her isolation, the cold floor beneath her, the pounding outside that had driven her to this breaking point. Lucille's thoughts fragmented further, her memories slipping away into a haze of light and sound. She was aware distantly of the sharp sting of tears at the corners of her eyes, the way her breath hitched in shallow gasps, the way the pain in her chest flared and ebbed like a cruel tide. The world tilted once more, the edges of her vision darkening, and her final conscious thought was a silent plea for her son, a desperate hope that he would return in time. The relentless knocking on the door finally ceased, though whether it was because Beverly had grown tired or because Lucille's perception of the world had slipped away, she couldn't tell. The silence that followed was almost more deafening than the pounding itself, a heavy, suffocating quiet that pressed down on her with an unforgiving weight. And then, just as her world faded to gray, a faint sound reached her ears, a distant siren, growing louder, a promise of help that was almost too late. Lucille's body sagged against the floor, her heartbeat slowing to an erratic, fragile rhythm, her breath barely a whisper of life. The storm outside had quieted, but the storm within her still raged, a fragile heartbeat away from silence. Shaq turned the corner of his mother's street with a contented smile, the errands done swiftly, the warm bread on the seat beside him, promising to complete their breakfast. He glanced at the sun-drenched neighborhood, the trees gently swaying, and the familiar houses standing proud against the clear sky. It was supposed to be a quiet Saturday morning, the kind where family routines settled in like comfortable old shoes. But as he pulled into Lucille's driveway, the tranquility shattered. The sight before him twisted his gut into a knot. The front door hung slightly ajar, the curtains inside unsettled as though caught by a passing wind. His breath caught, his pulse quickening as instinct overtook thought. Shaq left the bread on the passenger seat, swung the car door open, and sprinted up the steps. "Mom!" His voice cut through the stillness, loud but tinged with panic. He pushed the door open fully, his towering frame filling the doorway. The sight inside froze him. Lucille lay sprawled on the floor, her body limp, her breathing shallow. The faintest of sounds escaped her lips, a weak, tremulous gasp that sent a bolt of terror through Shaq's chest. His heart slammed against his ribs, but he forced himself to stay calm, moving swiftly to her side. He knelt, his large hands trembling, as he gently lifted Lucille's upper body, cradling her against his chest. Her skin was pale, clammy, her pulse faint beneath his fingertips. His mind raced with images, his strong, resilient mother brought to this fragile state. He pressed his cheek to her forehead, murmuring softly, "Hang in there, Mama. I'm here. I've got you." His phone was in his pocket, but for a moment his hands refused to fumble for it. He willed himself to think clearly, to act. He laid Lucille gently back against the floor and dialed 911, his voice steady though edged with urgency. "My mother's collapsed. She's barely breathing. I need an ambulance right now. Please hurry. Address is 1122 Cedar Grove." His voice cracked slightly at the end, but he snapped back into focus. While waiting for the ambulance, he assessed Lucille's condition, checking her pulse, watching the rise and fall or lack thereof of her chest. His own breath was shallow, but he fought against the rising tide of fear. His thoughts tumbled over themselves. This wasn't just a random fainting spell. The front door had been ajar, and the faint but unmistakable echoes of insistent knocking still seemed to linger in the air. His gaze flicked toward the window, where the curtain swayed as though recently disturbed. Someone had been here. His jaw tightened, a mix of anger and protectiveness washing over him. Who would harass his mother like this? Who would push her to the point of collapse with senseless aggression? He thought of the new neighbor Lucille had mentioned, the woman asking too many questions about property lines. Could it have been her? The pieces didn't yet fit, but the edges were sharp enough to cut. He paced the room briefly, glancing outside to see if the ambulance was arriving, then returned to Lucille's side, stroking her hand, murmuring soothing words. "It's going to be okay, Mama. They're on their way. Just stay with me." His voice, usually so commanding and full of life, was low now, a gentle tether pulling Lucille back toward consciousness. Outside, the distant wail of sirens grew louder, slicing through the neighborhood's quiet like a blade. Relief warred with urgency in Shaq's chest. He stepped to the door, flagging down the paramedics as they rushed up the steps. "She's inside. My mother." She collapsed. "Please, hurry." They moved in seamlessly, taking over with practiced efficiency. Shaq stepped back but hovered close, watching as they checked Lucille's vitals, administered oxygen, and prepped her for transport. His mother's frail form, dwarfed by the medical equipment, sent a fresh wave of determination surging through him. This wasn't just a health scare, it was the result of someone's deliberate actions, and he was going to find out why. As they loaded Lucille into the ambulance, Shaq climbed in beside her, his large frame barely fitting in the cramped space. The paramedics worked around him, but his presence was a steady anchor, his hand gripping Lucille's with unwavering strength. He could feel the faint pulse beneath his fingers, a fragile tether of life that refused to snap. His mind, though filled with fear, also sharpened with purpose. "Stay with me, Mama," he whispered, his voice low and steady. "Don't leave me. We're going to get you through this." The ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens, flashing lights, and whispered prayers. Shaq's thoughts turned over themselves, cycling through possibilities. Beverly Calloway. That was the name Lucille had mentioned, the woman who had been knocking on her door, asking questions. But this wasn't just idle curiosity. This was something deeper, something insidious. Why target his mother? Why not? By the time they arrived at the hospital, Lucille had stabilized slightly under the paramedics' care, but her breathing was still shallow, her pulse fragile. The doctors rushed her into a treatment room, leaving Shaq pacing the waiting area, his massive hands clenching and unclenching as he fought to contain the storm brewing inside him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from a neighbor, one of the few who knew him well enough to reach out directly. The message was brief, almost hesitant. "I saw what happened. That new woman, Beverly, was pounding on your mom's door like crazy before she collapsed. I tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen. Thought you should know." Shaq's blood ran cold. The pieces were falling into place, jagged and cruel. His mother's collapse wasn't a coincidence. It was the culmination of stress, fear, and unrelenting pressure from a woman who, for reasons yet unknown, had decided to turn Lucille's peaceful life into a battleground. As the doctor approached with a grim expression, Shaq squared his shoulders, his mind shifting from shock to resolve. His mother needed him, not just to be by her side, but to uncover the truth, to ensure that no one else would suffer from such reckless cruelty. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the hospital room, a stark contrast to the warmth of Lucille's home. Shaq sat beside his mother's bed, his large frame hunched, eyes fixed on the steady rise and fall of her chest. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was both a comfort and a reminder of how close he had come to losing her. Lucille's face was pale, her features drawn, but her breathing had stabilized, and the doctors were optimistic. Still, the image of her collapsed on the floor haunted him. As he held her hand, memories flooded his mind. Her laughter, her unwavering support, the countless sacrifices she had made. Anger simmered beneath the surface, not just at the incident, but at the underlying cause. Who would torment an elderly woman to the point of collapse, and why? A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Detective Harris, a seasoned officer with a calm demeanor, entered the room. "Mr. O'Neill, I have some information regarding the incident at your mother's residence. Shaq stood, his towering presence filling the room. What did you find? The detective gestured for Shaq to follow him into the hallway. We've identified the woman who was at your mother's door. Her name is Beverly Calloway. She moved into the neighborhood about 6 months ago. Shaq's brow furrowed. I've heard the name. My mother mentioned she had some issues with a new neighbor. Detective Harris nodded. Yes, and it seems those issues were more than just neighborly disputes. Beverly has a history of filing complaints against her neighbors, particularly those of a different race. She's been involved in several property disputes, often claiming that others are encroaching on her land. Shaq's fists clenched. So this was about land? Partially, the detective replied. Beverly has been trying to claim a portion of the land adjacent to your mother's property. She believes it was wrongfully taken from her family years ago. But there's more to it. Her actions suggest a deeper, more personal vendetta. Shaq's mind raced. What kind of vendetta? Beverly's family has a history in the area, Harris explained. They once owned several properties, but over time they lost most of them. There's a pattern of resentment, particularly towards African American families, who now own land that her family once claimed. It's a twisted sense of entitlement, masked as legal disputes. The pieces began to fall into place. Beverly's incessant knocking, her aggressive behavior. It wasn't just about property lines. It was about reclaiming a perceived loss, fueled by deep-seated prejudice. Back in the hospital room, Lucille stirred. Shaq rushed to her side, his heart pounding. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at him, a weak smile forming on her lips. Hey, Mama, he whispered, tears welling in his eyes. Lucille squeezed his hand gently. I'm okay, baby. Just a little tired. Shaq leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. You scared me. She chuckled softly. Didn't mean to. As she rested, Shaq's phone buzzed. It was a message from a neighbor. Heard about your mom. Beverly's been causing trouble for others too. Let me know if you need anything. Shaq's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about his mother. Beverly's actions were part of a larger pattern, one that threatened the peace and safety of the entire community. He turned to Detective Harris. What can we do to stop her? The detective sighed. We're gathering statements from other neighbors. If we can establish a pattern of harassment, we can take legal action. Shaq nodded. I'll talk to the community. We'll stand together. Over the next few days, Shaq met with neighbors, listening to their stories. Many had experienced Beverly's aggressive tactics, unfounded complaints, confrontations, and veiled threats. Together they compiled evidence, strengthening the case against her. At a community meeting, Shaq stood before the gathered residents. We all deserve to feel safe in our homes. Beverly's actions have crossed the line, and it's time we take a stand. The room erupted in applause, a unified front forming against the divisive force in their midst. As the legal proceedings against Beverly began, the community rallied together, supporting one another and reaffirming their commitment to inclusivity and respect. Lucille, recovering steadily, watched with pride as her son led the charge, turning a personal tragedy into a catalyst for positive change. In the end, Beverly's attempts to reclaim the past were thwarted by a community unwilling to be divided, proving that unity and resilience could overcome even the deepest of prejudices. The sun cast long shadows over the neighborhood. As Shaq stepped out of his car, the weight of unanswered questions pressing heavily on his shoulders. His mother, Lucille, was recovering, but the incident had left a scar that wouldn't fade easily. Determined to uncover the truth behind Beverly Calloway's relentless harassment, Shaq began his quest for answers. His first stop was the home of Harlan Decker, a reclusive ex-cop known for his keen observations and quiet demeanor. The old man opened the door cautiously, his eyes narrowing as he recognized Shaq. Mr. Decker, I was hoping to talk to you about Beverly Calloway. Shaq began, his voice steady. Harlan sighed, stepping aside to let Shaq in. I've been expecting someone to come around about her, he said, leading Shaq to a modest living room filled with memorabilia from his days on the force. Over cups of lukewarm coffee, Harlan recounted his experiences with Beverly. She's always been intense, but lately, it's like she's on a mission. I've seen her pacing around your mother's property, taking notes, even measuring the fence lines. Shaq leaned forward, concern etched on his face. Did she ever mention why? Harlan nodded slowly. She believes that part of your mother's land rightfully belongs to her. Claims her family was cheated out of it decades ago. But there's no record of that. It's all in her head. Thanking Harlan for his time, Shaq made his way to the home of Deidre Hensley, a lifelong neighbor and friend of Lucille. Deidre welcomed him with a warm smile, though her eyes held a hint of worry. "I heard about your mother, Shaq. I'm so sorry," she said, leading him to the kitchen. As they sat down, Shaq broached the topic of Beverly. Deidre's expression darkened. That woman has always had a chip on her shoulder. She moved in and immediately started causing trouble. Complaints about noise, property lines, even the color of our houses. Deidre revealed that Beverly had been spreading rumors about Lucille, insinuating that she had obtained her property through dishonest means. It's all baseless, of course, but Beverly's words have a way of sowing doubt. Shaq felt a surge of anger but kept his composure. "Do you think she's trying to force my mother out?" Deidre hesitated before nodding. "I wouldn't put it past her. She's been talking about reclaiming what's rightfully hers. It's like she's on a crusade." Armed with this information, Shaq began to piece together Beverly's motives. Her actions weren't just about property disputes. They were rooted in a deep-seated resentment, a belief that she had been wronged and that Lucille's success was a personal affront. Determined to protect his mother and their home, Shaq started documenting Beverly's behavior, gathering testimonies from neighbors, and consulting with legal experts. The community, once fragmented by Beverly's divisive tactics, began to unite in support of Lucille. As the days passed, whispers turned into voices of solidarity, and regrets transformed into resolve. Beverly's shadow loomed large, but the strength of a community determined to stand against prejudice and injustice proved even greater. The sun had barely begun its descent when Shaq pulled into the familiar cul-de-sac, the low hum of his engine fading beneath the rising tension that pulsed through his veins. The community had begun to stitch itself back together, stories exchanged, testimonies shared, but the wound inflicted on his family remained raw. There would be no peace, no closure, until the weight of truth was spoken, directly, unflinchingly, to the source. Today that meant Beverly Calloway. Shaq stepped from his vehicle with measured calm, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the pavement. Neighbors peered from behind curtains and cracked doors, whispers circling like wind through trees. His steps were slow, deliberate, not rushed or aggressive, but steady, a storm gathering its full force before unleashing itself not through chaos but through clarity. Beverly's house stood at the end of the block, its sharp-edged white siding contrasting with the deep greens of the surrounding trees. Shaq approached the front steps, his footsteps echoing soft. His presence alone demanded attention, and Beverly appeared in the doorway, her face tight with tension, arms crossed over her chest as though shielding herself from the inevitable. "You can't just come here and accuse me of things," she said, her voice sharp, brittle, but lacking the conviction it once carried. "I was within my rights to ask questions, to defend what belongs to me." Shaq's gaze met hers, steady and unwavering. "What belongs to you?" His voice was deep, calm, but it sliced through the air with precision. "A piece of land? A history that's only half the truth? Or is it something deeper, your pride, your resentment?" Beverly flinched, her posture tightening, but she held her ground. "You don't know what it's like. My family was here long before yours. We were pushed out, and people like you took what we had." Shaq stepped closer, his presence enveloping but never threatening. "My mother has lived here with dignity, with love, with respect for every neighbor, including you. The only thing she ever took was the space to grow her garden, to build a home, to raise her children. Your pounding on her door wasn't about property lines, Beverly. It was about anger, your anger, and it nearly killed her." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Beverly's lips parted as though to protest, but no sound came. Instead, her gaze faltered, dropping to the floor, her arms slowly uncrossing. The brittle shell around her began to fracture under the weight of Shaq's truth. "I know you've told yourself stories," Shaq continued, his tone measured but relentless. "Stories about how the world wronged you, about how people like my mother took what was yours. But that story isn't real. It's a shadow you've fed for so long. It's become your truth. Now it's hurting people, good people, because you can't let go." Beverly's jaw clenched, her knuckles whitening. "I just wanted what was mine," she whispered, the defiance draining from her voice. "I thought if I made enough noise people would listen, that they'd see I was right." Shaq's expression softened slightly, though the steel in his voice remained. "Noise doesn't make you right, Beverly. It just makes you loud. My mother, Lucille, She's in the hospital because you couldn't see past your own bitterness. She didn't deserve that. No one did. For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick with tension and unspoken regrets. Beverly's shoulders sagged, her breath hitching as though the weight of her actions was finally pressing down on her. Her bravado cracked, revealing the fragile, wounded person beneath. I didn't mean for it to go that far, she said, her voice barely audible. I didn't know how to stop. It felt like I was losing everything again. Shaq's eyes narrowed, not with anger but with understanding that cut deeper than any accusation. You lost everything because you couldn't let go of the past, and now you're tearing down your present with your own hands. You need to own that, Beverly, not hide behind excuses, not deflect with anger. Own it. Tears welled in Beverly's eyes, her facade crumbling. She opened her mouth, but no excuses came. Just a raw, broken whisper. I'm sorry. I didn't think it would hurt her like that. Shaq's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly. I believe you, but sorry doesn't fix what's been done. You need to make it right. Not with me, not with the neighbors, but with yourself. This ends now. No more knocking, no more accusations, no more hiding behind your family's ghosts. Beverly nodded, the fight drained from her posture, her gaze dropping to the steps between them. The woman who had once pounded on Lucille's door with the weight of her resentment now stood diminished, her anger spent and her regrets laid bare. Shaq took a step back, his voice softening, though the resolve remained. I'm not here to punish you, Beverly. I'm here to make sure you understand the damage you've caused. You need to take responsibility, and if you can't, the law will step in. Her lips trembled, but she nodded again. I understand. I'll stop. I'll fix it. Shaq turned, his broad shoulders straightening as he stepped back down the stairs. I hope you do, for everyone's sake. As he walked away, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the pavement. The air felt heavier, not with threat, but with the weight of truth finally spoken. Beverly remained on her porch, her figure small against the fading light, while neighbors cautiously emerged from their homes, their eyes following Shaq with a mixture of admiration and gratitude. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a reckoning, a chance for the community to reclaim its peace, and for Beverly to confront her own demons. Shaq didn't look back, but his steps were lighter, his purpose clear. The battle wasn't over, but the path forward had been carved, not through fists or threats, but through truth, spoken plainly, and dignity, preserved amidst the storm. As the air settled, and Beverly's confession lingered like the last fading notes of an unfinished song, Shaq's mind turned. Something in her voice, in the way her shoulders had slumped with resignation, hinted at a deeper truth waiting to be unearthed. This wasn't merely the end of a bitter neighbor's vendetta. It felt too calculated, too orchestrated. He sensed there was a layer beneath her words, an unseen hand manipulating the pieces of this ugly puzzle. Later that evening, Shaq sat in his mother's hospital room, the soft hum of monitors a constant reassurance that Lucille's fragile heartbeat was steady, her breathing even. She was asleep, a delicate peace settling over her features, but Shaq's mind refused rest. His thoughts turned back to Beverly's trembling voice, to her insistence that she hadn't meant to harm, that she was caught in something bigger than herself. He stepped into the hallway, pulling out his phone and scrolling through messages. One caught his attention, Idra Hensley's brief text. You need to talk to Harlan again. He's seen more than he let on. With a resolute breath, Shaq headed back to the neighborhood. At Harlan Decker's door, the old man answered with a wary look. But when Shaq pressed, his words steady, his eyes imploring, Harlan's guard fell. They sat in his living room once more, the air thick with unspoken truths. She wasn't acting alone, was she? Shaq asked, his voice low but insistent. Harlan sighed, rubbing a hand over his weathered face. You're not wrong. I didn't want to say anything at first, but I think you deserve to know. There's been talk, whispers about a developer, big money looking to buy up the neighborhood. They're offering cash, but they're leaning hard on the holdouts, trying to push them out without legal battles. Beverly got caught up in it. They fed her old grudges, made her believe she was fighting for something real. Shaq's stomach twisted. And my mother's house? It's the last one on this block standing in their way, Harlan said grimly. They thought if they pressured her, made her feel unsafe, she'd sell. Beverly was just their pawn. The revelation struck Shaq like a cold slap of water. All this time he'd focused on Beverly's personal resentment, her misguided sense of entitlement. But beneath it lay a more sinister game, corporate greed masked as neighborhood disputes, a manipulation that preyed on old wounds and prejudices. Determined to confirm the truth, Shaq reached out to a local real estate agent he trusted, a woman named Marlene Crow, who had always been straightforward with him about property matters. When he explained what he'd learned, her response confirmed his fears. "Yes, Shaq," Marlene said, her voice tense over the phone. "There's been a big developer sniffing around for months. They've made offers on nearly every property in the area. Some neighbors gave in for the payout, but others, like your mother, refused. They've been using every trick in the book to pressure the holdouts." "And Beverly?" Shaq pressed. "She was the perfect lever," Marlene said. "A neighbor with personal grievances, easy to manipulate. They fed her lies about the land, about your family's so-called claims, and let her loose. It was always about forcing a sale." The betrayal burned in Shaq's chest, a bitter mix of anger and determination. He returned to Beverly's house, this time not with confrontation, but with the intent to uncover the rest of the truth. She answered the door hesitantly, her expression wary. "Beverly," Shaq said, his voice low but firm, "I know you weren't acting alone. Who put you up to this? Who's behind the pressure on my mother and the others?" Her shoulders sagged as though the last of her defenses crumbled. "I didn't know at first," she murmured. "They came to me, said they'd help me with my claims, that I'd finally get what was owed to my family. But when I started digging, I realized they didn't care about me, or the land. They just wanted your mother out. They told me to keep pushing, to make her uncomfortable. I thought I was fighting for something real." Shaq's voice softened, though the weight of his anger remained. "They used you, Beverly. They preyed on your pain, your history to get what they wanted." Tears welled in her eyes, and for the first time Shaq saw not a villain but a broken person caught in a web spun by greed and manipulation. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." He nodded, the storm in his chest calming slightly. "If you want to make it right, you need to speak out. You need to tell the truth, not just to me but to the community." Together they approached the neighborhood meeting that night. Shaq stood tall, his voice steady as he explained what he'd learned. The developer's manipulations, the use of old grievances as leverage, the calculated campaign to force out the remaining residents. Beverly, her voice shaking but clear, confirmed his account, admitting her role and her regret. The room was thick with shock, murmurs rising, like a tide, as neighbors processed the betrayal. But Shaq's voice cut through the noise. "This isn't just about one person. It's about all of us. About standing up against those who think they can take what's ours through fear and deceit. We need to fight this together, not with anger or violence, but with truth and unity." As the meeting ended, a sense of renewed resolve filled the room. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now pledged their support. Shaq's calm leadership had turned a moment of potential fracture into a catalyst for community strength. Back in Lucille's hospital room, Shaq sat beside her, holding her hand as she rested. He knew the battle ahead would be long legal fights, public hearings, and more. But for the first time he felt the tide turning. The twist had revealed a truth more dangerous than Beverly's resentment, a system willing to exploit pain for profit, and Shaq was ready to fight, not just for his mother, but for everyone who called this neighborhood home. The sun rose over the neighborhood, casting long, determined shadows on the gathering crowd. Shaq stood at the center of the park's small amphitheater, his imposing figure commanding attention, but his face was a blend of grief and resolve. Neighbors who had once whispered quietly from behind their windows now stood together, shoulder to shoulder, united by a shared outrage and a newfound sense of purpose. It wasn't just about Lucille anymore. It was about everyone who had been silenced or pushed aside by those who thought their power was absolute. Shaq looked out at the familiar faces, faces that carried lines of worry, of endurance, of quiet strength. He cleared his throat, the murmur of the crowd falling into a hush. His voice, when it came, was low but carried a weight that rippled through the gathering, like a steady tide. "Friends," he began, his deep voice echoing off the park's stone walls, "we all know why we're here today. Some of you watched as my mother was nearly lost to the greed of people who thought they could break her spirit and ours. Some of you have been on the receiving end of quiet threats, of sudden offers that came not from a place of kindness but from the shadowy hands of those who want to erase us." The air grew still, the weight of his words pressing into every listening ear. He paused, letting the silence settle before continuing. "They thought we wouldn't notice," he said, his voice rising with controlled passion. They thought they could divide us by whispering lies, by exploiting old grievances, by feeding on fear and prejudice. But they were wrong. They underestimated the strength of this community, the power of truth, and the weight of justice. Shaq's gaze moved across the crowd, catching the eyes of those who had spoken to him in confidence. Harlan Decker, Deidre Hensley, and even Beverly, standing at the edge of the group. Her shoulders hunched but her eyes open, listening. Her confession had cracked the developer's carefully woven lies. But it was Shaq's voice now that carried the truth forward. My mother's home wasn't just a house, he said, his tone deepening. It was a promise. A promise that no one gets to erase the hard work and dignity of those who built their lives here. Lucille O'Neill stood strong not just for herself, but for everyone who believed in community, in fairness, in doing right by each other. And they tried to tear that down, not with fists, not with open violence, but with something worse: quiet pressure, legal traps, and whispered threats. That's how they win, by making us feel alone. His hand gestured wide, encompassing the crowd. But we are not alone. A murmur of agreement spread through the audience, soft but resolute. Shaq's voice softened, but the conviction remained unshaken. We are not powerless. We are not voiceless. We are not going to let them decide who stays and who goes, who deserves safety and who should live in fear. We are standing here today to say that our lives, our stories, our homes, they matter. He let the words sink in, the raw truth of them settling over the crowd like a blanket of resolve. His heart pounded in his chest, a steady reminder of the stakes, of the history that could not be erased by greed or prejudice. I'm not asking you to fight, he said, his voice steady, but I am asking you to stand. Stand for your neighbors. Stand for the ones who think they're alone. Stand for justice, for truth, and for a future where no one has to face what my mother did. I've seen what silence does. I've seen what fear can cost. But I've also seen what we can accomplish when we refuse to be silent. The sun climbed higher, catching the determination etched into every face. Children stood beside their parents. Teenagers listened intently. Elders nodded in agreement. Even those who had once remained on the sidelines now felt the pull of unity, the call to protect what was rightfully theirs. Shaq's voice lowered, his tone intimate, as though speaking directly to each person present. We can't let them win. Not here. Not now. This isn't just about one woman, one family, or one home. It's about all of us. It's about making sure that no one can buy their way through our lives, that no one can use fear and lies to push us aside. They tried to erase us, but we're still here, and we're not going anywhere. A surge of applause rose, breaking the silence like a wave, growing louder as more voices joined in, a swelling tide of unity that echoed against the stone walls. Shaq raised his hand, not to silence them, but to steady the energy, to channel it into action. Let's make this clear to anyone watching, anyone listening, he said, his voice rising above the cheers. We are not for sale. Our dignity is not for sale. Our homes are not for sale. And our silence is not for sale. We stand together, and we will protect each other. The applause swelled again, this time accompanied by cheers, by calls of agreement, by the collective realization that they were not powerless after all. Shaq felt the weight of their hope, their courage, their newfound resolve. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be legal battles, public hearings, and the slow grinding wheels of justice. But he also knew that this moment, this stand, had shifted the balance. As the crowd began to disperse, neighbors lingered in small groups, exchanging words of encouragement and determination. Shaq stood quietly, watching them, feeling the weight of their shared purpose settle over the park like a promise. His phone buzzed. A message from the hospital. Lucille was awake, asking for him. With a deep breath, he turned toward his car, his steps measured but lighter than they had been in days. The battle was far from over, but the stand had been made, not with fists or threats, but with truth, unity, and a voice too strong to be silenced. The first rays of morning light bathed the neighborhood in a soft glow, a gentle golden hue that spilled across the familiar houses and tree-lined streets. Shaq stood on the front porch of his mother's home, the same place where their quiet Saturday had begun what felt like a lifetime ago. But this morning, the air was different, less burdened by tension, more filled with the quiet strength of a community that had faced a storm and found itself stronger in the aftermath. Lucille sat in her favorite chair by the window, her face turned toward the light. The soft lines of her features relaxed as she sipped her tea. Her recovery had been slow but steady, each day bringing back a little more of her vitality, her humor, her quiet grace. Shaq had been at her side through it all, his own burdens lightened by the collective support of neighbors who had once stood apart, but now stood together. The house was filled with the subtle hum of life. Voices from the kitchen where Deidre Hensley and a few others had gathered to prepare breakfast, the faint laughter of children playing in the yard, the comforting scent of coffee brewing. Shaq leaned against the doorway, watching his mother with a quiet reverence, the weight of the past days finally beginning to lift from his shoulders. "I told you, Mama," he said softly, stepping inside. "We're still standing." Lucille looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and reached for his hand. "Yes, baby, we're still standing." In the days that had followed Shaq's impassioned stand at the community meeting, the neighborhood had undergone a subtle but profound transformation. Where once there had been silence and suspicion, there was now conversation and cooperation. Neighbors who had previously kept their distance were now sharing meals, planning gatherings, and talking openly about the need to protect what they had built together. The developers' plans had faltered, their schemes exposed, and their influence diminished by the collective voice of a community unwilling to be divided. Beverly Calloway, though still living on the edge of the neighborhood, had retreated from her aggressive tactics. Shaq had watched her from a distance, noting the way her posture had changed. Less confrontational, more uncertain. She had not apologized publicly, but her silence spoke volumes, a quiet acknowledgement of the harm she had caused. There was no redemption in her story yet, but there was the faintest glimmer of understanding, the first fragile steps towards something better. Shaq didn't need her confession or contrition. He had come to understand that some wounds weren't healed by words but by actions, by choosing to build bridges instead of walls, by refusing to let bitterness dictate the future. He had seen how easily anger could become a weapon, how fear could be manipulated into hate, but he had also seen how truth spoken with courage and compassion could cut through that darkness and lead to something stronger. As the morning unfolded, Shaq joined his neighbors outside, where a long table had been set under the shade of an old oak tree. Plates of food appeared, hands reaching across the table to serve one another, voices rising in laughter and shared stories. The tension that had once gripped the street had loosened, replaced by a sense of community that felt earned, not manufactured. Lucille, moving slowly but with growing confidence, made her way to the table, her steps supported by Shaq's steady arm. The neighbors rose, offering her a seat at the head of the table, a quiet tribute to her resilience and dignity. She accepted with a gracious nod, her smile warm as she looked around at the gathered faces. "We made it through," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that stilled the group. "Not because we fought harder, but because we stood together. Let's remember that." Shaq squeezed her shoulder, pride swelling in his chest. "That's right, Mama. This isn't just about today. It's about tomorrow and every day after. It's about making sure no one feels alone, no one feels powerless." The meal unfolded with easy camaraderie, the sun climbing higher, casting dappled patterns of light and shadow on the grass. Children chased each other between tables, their laughter rising like birdsong. Conversations meandered from plans for a community garden to shared memories of Lucille's kindness over the years. The neighborhood, once fractured by fear and mistrust, was slowly stitching itself back together, each shared story a thread in a tapestry of resilience. Shaq found a moment to step aside, leaning against the old oak, his gaze sweeping over the scene. He thought of the journey that had brought them here, the quiet morning shattered by knocks at the door, the fear in his mother's eyes, the truth he had uncovered about Beverly and the developers' manipulations. He thought of his own anger, how easily it could have consumed him, how tempting it had been to answer aggression with aggression. But he had chosen another path, one of patience, of dignity, of truth spoken not to wound, but to heal. Beverly lingered on the edge of the gathering, her presence a silent reminder of the complexities they had faced. Shaq met her gaze briefly, offering a small nod of acknowledgement. Not of forgiveness, not yet, but of recognition. The past could not be erased, but the future could still be written differently. As the afternoon light softened, painting the sky with hues of amber and rose, Shaq returned to his mother's side. Together they watched the neighborhood come alive with the quiet strength of those who had weathered a storm and found, in its aftermath, a deeper understanding of what it meant to be a community. Lucille's hand rested on his, her grip firm. "You did good, son," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "You reminded us all that standing tall doesn't mean standing alone." Shaq smiled, the tension that had shadowed him for days easing into something softer, something more enduring. "We've still got work to do, Mama," he said, his voice low and steady. but we'll do it, together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, peaceful shadows across the street, the neighborhood settled into a quiet that was no longer filled with fear, but with hope. It was, truly, the dawn of a new day. This isn't just Shaq's story. It's the story of every community that refuses to be silenced. Stand tall, speak up, and take back what's yours. Let's rewrite the narrative together, with unity and resilience as our pen, ready to turn the page,